All right. So it's hard. This is hard because it's just one sentence. It is easier when you have multiple sentences or like a paragraph to paraphrase. So what is he doing? Okay. Yeah. So President Bush opens his address by, now that I used address, can we use another verb? Instead of addressing the attacks. It'd be crazy if you had a whole couple of yellow pages that have other verbs that you could use. Because I stole address. So President Bush opens his address by look at what he's gonna do, right? Look at what he's going into. By what? That works for me. The terrorist attacks that morning. So there's a couple of things that we've done in here, and you'll understand it when we talk about a line of reasoning, right? But it's kind of about like the order of thinking. So what we're doing here with the first half is we're telling the reader, and when I say the reader, I mean the person grading your paper, right? We're telling the reader, hey, our paper is going to go chronologically, first half, second half. Then when we paraphrase and embed with context, now we're telling the reader where our evidence is coming from, and we understand the value of the evidence coming in that order, right? So we're kind of leading the reader through how we see the passage happening, right? The value within the passage. Okay. So now what I have to do is I have to find something to connect this to that grammatically, right? So if we look at this, what did we label, like what were our labels for that piece of evidence? I'm going to put down our labels down here because that's what our questions are going to be over. What did we label our piece of evidence? Okay, we labeled lists, or a list, right? Is there anything else we labeled it in there? The colon, which, that kind of goes into the list. Did we talked about the conjunction, right? In there, but I think the conjunction, now that we see and we've read a little bit, creates like parallels, right? Because you have men and women, military work, military and federal, moms, dads, friends, and neighbors, right? So we can look at the list and parallelism. So really, the part of this quote that we want, because we don't have to use the whole thing, is going to be the list itself, right? That's going to be the part that we want to use. So what I can do, I can mark that part out, start my quote there, and now I have to figure out how those two pieces go together, right? By describing the terrorist attacks that morning, secretaries, businessmen and women, military and federal workers. So we have a couple of options. Sometimes you can figure out how those two things go together, but when I take out a part of a sentence, the easiest thing to do is to paraphrase those two things, or paraphrase that. Now, if I were to just put President Bush opens his address by describing the terrorist attacks that morning, period. The victims were in airplanes or in their offices, blah, 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 blah. If I ended up just putting those two things together, what I have is a run-on sentence, right? Because I have two complete thoughts. So what I have to do is I have to figure out a way to maneuver those two complete thoughts into one sentence so that it grammatically fits. So turn to your partner, see if there is a way that you can make this top part match this bottom part. Ready, set, go. Whoever phone that is driving me crazy. Vanessa, you find it, you win. Was it 30? Was it that one? You find if it rings again, you find it. It's you win. I don't know what you win. I'll give you a seltzer. How about that? Okay. All right. What are some of my options? Yes.
I'm very confused on how we're supposed to do this.
You're supposed to think through it. You're supposed to find words that make those two things go together. What options do you have? Here's what happens. Here's what I know about y'all. In 9th and 10th grade, y'all have learned that if you wait long enough, when a teacher asks a question, what does that teacher do? Gives you the answer. Guess who that's not? So, the other thing that I know about you is that if you have just sat like idly by and just kind of copied things down in boxes as we were working through, you're faking your way through the intellectual work that it takes to get better. Where do I find that out? Oh, on the skill 1 through 3 test. Right? So, what you have to be okay with in here is okay putting out an answer and it being wrong. You're going to be wrong. If you're not wrong 1,000 times in this class this semester, you're not doing something right. What can't happen is it can't be Ava and I just talking. Which is great. She's bailed you out. Her and Christian have bailed y'all out a lot. So you're going to have to think your way through this, because the way that this will work is we're doing this as a class. Tomorrow you're going to be doing it in a group. Next week you're going to be doing it with a partner. Into next week you're going to be tested and you're going to be doing it on your own. So if the whole time all you do is just sit back and relax and just write things down and wait for other people to answer, next week when I give you a test, what's going to happen? Your grade's going to be worse than the grade that you get here because the scale is even larger. Right? So I'm going to give you 30 seconds again to try to figure out how are we going to make those two sentences or parts of sentences fit together. You got 30 seconds. Ready, set, go. You're not doing what you're supposed to. You're not doing what you're supposed to. For your computer. Okay, give me some options. Anderson.
President Bush opens the address by describing the terrorist attacks that morning
And those who were affected, secretaries, businessmen, and women. Does that mesh? It's close. Okay, David.
President Bush opens his address by describing the terrorist attacks that morning, mentioning the victims by mentioning.
okay, how about instead of such as, so that morning, President Bush opens his address by describing the terrorist attacks that morning and by mentioning that the victims were secretaries, businessmen and women, military and federal workers, moms and dads, friends and neighbors. Does that work? President Bush opens his address by describing the terrorist attacks that morning and by mentioning that the victims were secretaries, businessmen and women, military and federal workers, moms and dads, friends and neighbors. Does that work? Usually when you combine like those two things, two sentences, usually, I can't tell you all the time how it's going to happen, but usually you have to have some kind of verb, right, to connect the two ideas, right? Okay, good. Notice that this is not Bush says, ugh, right? That does not count as embedding. That will get an ugh on your paper. And probably a frowny face if I see it more than once. Okay? All right. So now let's get to the labels or our analysis questions. These are things, this is like our thinking questions, right? When I started coming up with this, it was because it's easy for me to just sit here and say, okay, let's work through this, right? And talk about the analysis of this. But what we have to do is I need you to start thinking like, what questions can I ask? It is never going to be, what does that mean? This is always going to be you arguing the value of that piece of evidence. And that always has to be with the label, right? We're always talking about the label. So I'm going to ask questions. So we talked about the list. I'm scared to tell you this because the last time I told you about something that I like, all y'all did was find those things and not look for patterns. But when we find a list, I love a list because how many times have y'all chosen a piece of evidence in years past and you go, I know this is a good piece of evidence, and then all you can do is write one sentence about it. And then you're like, oh, I'm supposed to write like 2 or 3. Let me just paraphrase again. And you just write the same thing multiple times, right? When you find a list, there's multiple things that you can look at. So I look at the list as a whole, okay? So, why is there value in the whole list of victims? What these questions will eventually do is the answers to them is going to be our analysis, right? So I like to look at the list as a whole, but then I also like to look at the value of the individual things in the list, right? Why is there value in each individual, and we're pairing it, right? Pair in the list. So I like the list as a whole. I like talking about the individual things in the list. I also like talking about the order of the list. So why is there value in the order of the list? Does that make sense? So as I would be writing the analysis for this, I would be thinking that in my head. Okay, here's my piece of evidence. I like the list. What is the whole list? Like, what's the value in that whole list? Right? Then the answer to that is my analysis. Then I'd go, okay, now it's the whole list. Now what do those individual things mean? Like, what do they represent? Right? So that's kind of my process of thinking through it. The other thing that we talked about is parallel, right? So here I can say, like, why are the pairs, and we had conjunction in there too, right? Because the conjunction kind of creates the parallelism. Why are the pairs connected with and? Why are the pairs paralleled? Bless you. notice that none of my questions are, what does that list mean? I have to talk about the power in that list, okay? All right, so now the dozen connection, this is our analysis. One thing we have to remember here is we must identify our labels. We have to identify our labels. That's where rhetorical analysis comes in, right? When I'm reading papers, I have to understand what you're analyzing. Like, you can't just tell me there's a piece of evidence. What's in that piece of evidence that is rhetoric, right? So we can identify our labels by just clearly identifying them, or sometimes our labels can turn into verbs. And when we do that, then we have our labels in there. Remember how I said, like, one of the RAVs that's on the list is a call to action, right? And I don't want to use that as a RAV, like especially in our claims. But if you label a call to action as a label, then you can then make it a verb, right? All right, y'all ready? Talk to your partner. See if you can answer that first question. Don't write it down because you'll screw it up. Talk to your partner. Why is there value in that whole list of victims? Turn to your partner, go. All right. Talk to me. Why is there value in the whole list?
Because like these people are more than just like a number of deaths. It's like they're real people.
Ooh, okay. I like that. Keep that in mind. I like that. What else, Abby?
It shows that it's just like normal, ordinary people.
Okay. Christian?
I was gonna say it could be like you, it could be anyone.
Okay.
Others are listening, like who else is listening?
All right. All right. So I'm going to go with Jabril's. We all kind of said around the same thing, right? So Bush lists, right? There's my label. Turn it into a verb. Bush lists all the victims. Okay. Jabril, tell me what you said again.
Like list them as more of people with like jobs and families than like a death.
Okay, because it shows that each individual had an identity. Beyond just being numbered in the death toll. Okay, I like that. Okay, now we're looking at the list as a whole. Now, why is there value in each pair in the list? Turn to your partner. Thomas, what you said last time was right, like would fit here.
I know. I just
Right?
don't like talking.
No, but I'm saying like what y'all were talking about before fits this answer now. Yeah. Don't you think? So what's the value of each one of those pairs?
I don't know. I'm not too sure about this.
All right. What do we think? Where's the value in the pairs? Ethan?
It makes it like more relatable because he could have ended at like people in the towers or in the airplanes, but he keeps going further and describing them like it could be your parents or a friend or your neighbor.
Okay. So each pair of victims allows, now I'm going to kind of move into a little bit of connecting with audience, right? Though I don't never, ever, ever say audience, right? So allows, grieving Americans already know who the victims are, right? Is there another description of Americans, even though we know, like everybody knew what happened that day, but is there a description we have of Americans for the audience that would help us translate into the idea of like relating to personal Americans?
Distraught Americans.
Okay. Allows not only distraught Americans to identify. Ethan, what'd you say again? That they're like relatable, right?
Yeah.
So then let's say to relate. What are they relating to? Like the loss.
Yeah. It's like it goes further than just being somebody in the towers.
Okay. Each pair of victims allows not only distraught Americans to relate to the loss of these individuals, who also does it allow?
Unaffected.
No.
Vice versa.
I mean, I could group those under distraught Americans. Think beyond America. But it also allows, how would this relate to another audience? Okay, but it also allows our allies to realize what?
Realize all the groups that are being affected.
They already see that. That's not what they realize.
The weakness of America.
Ooh. So not just the weakness in America, because the allies already see, like they realize that. So if they realize that Americans have a weakness, maybe not a weakness, maybe a vulnerability, then what? Then it can happen to them as well, right? So it also allows our allies to realize they are just as vulnerable to this type of attack as we are. I hate ending with are, but I'll leave it. Okay? Why is there value in the order of the list? Now, sometimes this works, sometimes this doesn't. David?
It starts becoming more personal, like it starts with secretaries of this and moves into moms and dads.
Okay.
And neighbors.
So why is that valuable?
Because it like personally impacts them.
kind of what we said before, right? Where are the secretaries, businessmen, and women? Where were they? In the what? Okay. Where were the military and federal workers? In the Pentagon. Where could we say moms and dads, friends, and neighbors were? In the plane. In the airplane that crashed in Pennsylvania. Oh! Why? This list mirrors the order of the planes I don't like hitting, but hitting each target.
Good striking word.
Yeah, yeah. First plane hit the towers. Next plane hit the Pentagon. Bless you. The third plane was taken down in a field in Pennsylvania. Okay. I could get into this, but I think that's good. So, listen to the first chunk. This is half of a paragraph. Okay? In the first half, President Bush fervently portrays America's resilience. President Bush opens his address by describing the terrorist attacks that morning and by mentioning that the victims were secretaries, businessmen and women, military and federal workers, moms and dads, friends and neighbors. Bush lists all the victims because it shows that each individual had an identity beyond just being numbered in the death toll. Each pair of victims allows not only distraught Americans to relate to the loss of these individuals, but it also allows our allies to realize they are just as vulnerable to this type of attack as we are. The list mirrors the order of the planes striking each target. First plane hit the Twin Towers, next plane hit the Pentagon, the third plane was taken down on a field in Pennsylvania. Is anything in their summary? Say no. Now, one question that I had somebody ask earlier is, okay, so where are we showing resilience? So usually, we could look at this chunk and go, okay, how does this show my claim? How does this prove my claim, right? Here, does this show resilience? No. But for our claim now and the definition of resilience, we have to show what happened to show how we overcame it, right? So the second chunk will help show that. And then at the end of the second chunk, we'll connect it together with what I call a bow tie. Okay? Also, somebody goes, but if we're supposed to show America's strength, how are we doing that? We're building in our line of reasoning. This is why claims are so important. If your claim answers how or why to the purpose, and then your evidence proves your claim, then everything proves your purpose, right? Because all the math works backwards, right? So once we get into like talking about a line of reasoning, we've created a line of reasoning there. Yes? That, my friends, is half of a body paragraph. Tomorrow,